Hey everybody, my name is Sajjad. I work at Mapbox from the Bangalore office along with Pratik and a bunch of folks who are here today. I'm really glad to be here. Glad to be here. This is my second Hot Summit, and super excited to talk about my personal experience and point of view of being a part of an activation last year during the Nepal earthquake. I think my presentation is going to cover a lot of the hopes and ideas that Heather presented this morning and some of the processes that Pratik spoke about earlier today in terms of how we can improve a lot of things. I still want to just run through very specific things that I thought that we need to pay more attention to and also work towards now that all of us are here in the same room. Okay, let's just work. So I think the Nepal earthquake still kind of stays with all of us. It's been mentioned several times already in the last hour. And I think the reason why we still talk about it is because it was very devastating, and also like to see there were many people who were friends of us who were also involved. So this was in April 2015. One of the things I really like about the way HOT takes care of activations is that we're very prompt and we're very quick. So this is an email that Manning shared to the HOT mailing list just a few hours from the earthquake. And just as a follow-up here, he immediately starts a Skype group that's there now to talk about international coordination and how we want to do the activation. So we're very fast in terms of responding and also identifying the situation to be able to respond. Immediately, there's a question of who is there locally for us to get more information about what are the areas that we need to map, what's the requirement on the ground. So I don't know if you guys know about the Kathmandu Living Labs, but they've been around for a few years. They do some amazing work based in Kathmandu, mapping and also building capacity around that in that part of the world. So obviously that name came up. Nama does an amazing job of leading the Kathmandu Living Labs team. There's already been communication. So I'm going to be sharing some bits and pieces in the chat that I think is relevant to sort of get my point across. Pierre proposes that we could potentially do a 24-hour OSM response, and that's not always the case. It's very hard to get a 24-hour OSM response, and that's because we don't have many anchors. We need to sort of build that kind of people around the world who can start becoming anchors, who can come on board to the activation leadership. This is, I think, in the morning over there in Bangalore and very close to where we are in Nepal. Nama is asking in the chat, is anybody there in the channel right now? And Manning is based in the Philippines at that point of time, and he responds. And there's immediately an ask in the channel about having to map a certain part of Nepal. This is why I kind of call this the middle ground, because I'm sort of sitting in Bangalore and watching all of this happen. And I'm not far away from Nepal, but I'm also not so close to the rest of the OSM community who is actually doing the mapping work. So for me, it was sort of a very interesting perspective of being close to the field as well as helping rest of the volunteers sort of coordinate this activation. So we need to sort of build that group of people around the world very proactively. One of the things that we were able to do as Mapbox very well was to sort of huddle many groups of people around the country in India to start mapping in OSM for the Nepal activation. I wrote a blog post on the HOT website right after that about how that was possible and what we need to do. There was sort of a moment when all of us were suddenly sending out emails to different groups of people around the country because we wanted more mappers in the same time zone. There were more asks while everyone was awake at KLL. And there were like specific requests like, okay, we need to immediately map this area because the Red Cross is deploying something over there. we sent out many emails like this, and they suddenly managed to get a group of people around the country to map different projects. One of the things I think we did very well is that we put together really short guides and documentation on how to get started to mapping. I think Hot and OSM does an amazing job of kind of creating tutorials, but I think we need to make this more accessible. There's a need for sort of helping people find where things are, and also there's a need for a small group of people to always kind of focus on onboarding new mappers. And I think Heather said this very well, that like we need to sort of create that mentorship and buddying system within Hot to be able to do this very well. I think a few of my colleagues in the office spend a lot of time on Skype and on the phone, just talking to many people around the country and in that part of the world, just training them. So we would do screen shares, we would just like get on the phone to just ask or hear questions about how they want to map. And this is certainly like, I feel like this is the way forward, because people are always almost intimidated to send like, hey, how do I tag this street to the Hot mailing list or the OSM mailing list, because they've all gotten so big and sort of focuses have changed. And that sort of idea stayed with us for a little bit, and a few of us started working on putting together what does it take to like start mapping in OSM. And this is sort of a pretty high-level guide of becoming an expert mapper using JOSM, validation, and all of those things. But we were able to sort of pull very small pieces out of this to put together a very focused guide. This is out on the website as well if anyone wants to take a look, and you're welcome to just like use it in whatever ways you want. I felt that a lot of things were easy from my perspective because we had resources that were ready. So I would get messages from Prabhas or folks at the Kathmandu Living Labs that they immediately need maps that they can print. So we were able to sort of execute this because we had that group of people and the set of tools that we could immediately go into. This is sort of a capacity that we need to build. So the first iteration of the map looked like this. Hot has sort of a mechanism around being able to make print maps, but I think one of the things that was important in the Nepal case was that they wanted more customization, which wasn't easy to do very quickly. And there was also that sort of a technical debt. There are people who built that has not sort of developed very organized documentation that requires someone else that helps someone else to immediately start hacking on it. And then this is a chat between me and Prabhas, and he's trying to reach out to me to ask some questions about that map. And turns out they were using a black and white printer, and the colors quite don't work. So we were able to sort of turn this around in just a couple of hours because we had that sort of resources ready. So we need to build that sort of a capacity around the community, around the world, to be able to do that really quickly. This is another example of having that resource ready all the time. So Amy is trying to create a map of Kalinchok village, but is not finding any reasonable amount of data to actually make a pretty map. So she asked Ruben if he could map that place, and immediately Ruben gets to do that. Prateek touched on a lot of how the imagery coordination and the requests work, and the imagery request repository on GitHub actually does a pretty amazing job of just handling requests and communication. I don't think many people know about this, and that's something that we need to sort of like push out, make more people aware of. So there was a conversation between Cristiano and Kevin. Both of them are in this room, where like Cristiano was suddenly saying that, okay, these tasks need better imagery, and then Kevin immediately responds. So there's sort of a prompt proactive response. One of the things that I want to point out here is that much of the imagery request work happened when the US and the Europe was awake. A lot of like the imagery requests were coming from Nepal, but we weren't able to do anything because we didn't have the capacity to do that. Which is why all of us got started thinking about, okay, what if we can try and do this way before then something happens? This is sort of kind of, I think, very obvious. but I wasn't like very deeply involved in the activation, but we reached out to a huge amount of people around the country and outside, and we would randomly get emails that suddenly a group of people wants to donate solar lamps into Nepal. And I wonder like their motivation to reach out to me or groups of people like us. And I sort of understand their perspective, but sometimes it's important to kind of like stay focused. Arun, my colleague, he works along with us. He had a lightning talk earlier today. He posted this on Facebook, and this came through, I think we found this in the Skype channel as well. This gentleman is talking about how no relief has reached 2 days later, the earthquake. It's sort of heartbreaking to read this. I can share this later if you guys want to read it, but essentially he's saying that he had to walk 3 hours overnight to get to the spot where he had connectivity to share this message on Facebook. So sometimes things like this sort of make you wonder what we're doing and what's the reach of the things that we're doing. And I think my realization from that is it's very hard to like do everything and sort of keep the focus and do what we can really do at that point of time. Activations are sort of stressful for many people, especially if you're very close to the time zone. There's always communication. There's always people asking questions. There's always some request, or there's always a need. One of the things that kept all of us going was the motivation that was part of the community. Pictures like this sort of like give you a boost. So this is officers of the Canadian Air Force looking over a map that is printed out from OpenStreetMap, which has the data that all of us collected in the last 48 hours. So, which is pretty amazing to see that people are actually using this map. Dale makes a comment on the Skype channel. I want this this gives you a sense of activity during the Nepal earthquake activation for a few days. So you can see there are definitely spikes of the amount of chain sets that were posted, but you can kind of like see the number of like active users. So that was a true 24-hour activation. We had people around the clock, around the world, editing the map and contributing to OSAM for the Nepal earthquake. This is one thing that we need to spend a lot more time to like think about. HOT is going to places like we saw on the map earlier that Prateek shared. We're mapping in different parts of the world in different time zones for pre-activations and post-activation, post-crises. But I think there's less conversations about what's the backup. This is a very interesting conversation. I think the first message that Dale sends is about, okay, everyone just went to sleep. Now what do I do, right? And that talks about having more anchors. There's certainly power is back at KLL. Nama is meeting the Nepalese Red Cross, and everything's fine right now. But Mikhail just says that the tasking manager just fell over. Now, tasking manager is one of the crucial pieces of what we do. If the tasking manager breaks, we won't get mappers to map, right? They're going to turn away. We need to think about sort of building that sort of a backup. Fortunately, in this case, the tasking manager was fixed in the next 40 to 50 minutes. All the administrators were notified. So there are only a handful of people who actually know what goes behind the scene. It's sort of an overlap about the training bit, but I wanted to emphasize on building very spot-on guides. All the guides that we have so far sort of focus on any activation is a general like introduction to mapping, general introduction to tasking manager. One of the things that we were missing during the Nepal earthquake was we took on a lot of validation work. And one of the things that we're missing, we didn't know what to validate. We didn't know what we should look for when we were validating a task. So we had to put together guides to teach everyone on like what do you need to look for when you're validating a particular project. And this is different for different projects, and you need to have that sort of understanding of what people on the field are looking for to be able to validate this. So we need to create this kind of guides, and there needs to be like a process where we can talk about these very specific focused guides. Heather touched on this a little bit earlier today. I think I was really impressed by KLL's sort of flexibility to try different things while they were at the spot when the earthquake was happening, and just sort of like seeing all the chaos that's around them. So they deployed like an Ushahidi instance where people could report safety, people could report requests for mapping and all of that. And they were proactively trying to verify those reports as well. And this is, I think, one of the less spoken bits of what we do at Heart. There's always that need of like sending maps to the ground, but there's less talking about how do we verify the things that we're actually collecting. So on diversifying tool sets, one of the examples that I can share based on like my perspective was that, so in April 2015, we were working on two very important pieces of our data work at Mapbox. One of them is called tile reduce. It's a JavaScript library that lets you like parse OSM data quite fast in under 20 minutes for the whole world. And vector tile sets of like full fidelity OSM data that's generated every day for the whole planet. So we were experimenting with that. We ran a small snippet of code that identifies disconnected highways or disconnected streets. This is quite common for a hot project. What happened, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the tasking manager, but essentially if you take a block, you usually kind of leave the edge of the block without connecting that street to the next block, and someone else is sort of tracing the other block. And this sort of happens a lot, and it directly breaks routing or whoever is loading up that app on OSM and or on their phone, right? So this is directly related to validation work, but we need to sort of experiment and diversify our tool chains a bit more. We need a lot of expert mappers. I think a few tasks from the Nepal activation, one of them was this, where we were specifically asked to map this northeastern section of the Borang village, where we need to deliver fast. We need to make sure the data that we add is very good quality, because we only have a very short period of time before someone going out on the field who wants to use the data. So we don't really have a lot of time to actually start validating this data, right? The other one was mapping internally displaced people. I think this one, we created guides, and I think Hot did a pretty amazing job of like putting together a quick guide of what are the cues that you look for in satellite imagery to identify where people have moved. So that's kind of like one of the tasks. The other one, which we couldn't really help, was there was a conversation between Nirab, Prabhas, and me where Nirab was asking that, okay, one of the most sensitive data that we really need to deliver and work on is to find out where helicopters could land in Nepal. So we sort of relayed this message to everyone in Hot, but also took on to ourselves to see if we can take care of that. But it was still very complicated to do. So we went back to KLL and said, look, listen, the satellite imagery that we have isn't good enough to actually being able to do that. So there needs to be that level of understanding of what's possible and what's not possible, especially when the time is really sensitive. I think a lot of the things during the Nepal activation was easy because there were very clear communication. I don't know if you guys have seen these email reports that Manning and Peary were sending after their shifts. So Peary, I think, was based somewhere in the US, and Manning was based in the Philippines. So they would sort of do shifts to make sure the 24-hour cycle of Hot activation goes. These activation summaries were super helpful for many people, including the volunteers, to just see the numbers, spots that need priority mapping, the missing pieces, satellite imagery requests, and what's failing or what's working very well. Kathmandu Living Labs, for over a month, they wrote a situation report on their blog post about what was exactly happening and what were they thinking and what they wanted to do. The biggest difference here that I want to point out is that I had to literally fish through my email to find these. And some of them you can see are actually like screenshots that I had to get Manning to send me. And it was very hard to find what exactly happened during this activation. So I had to literally sit down with Manning before I came here for about an hour and 20 minutes and sort of like talk about the whole story, because we've all sort of forgotten the details of what happened. And I think this is something that we need to do better. Like, is there a place where we can post this which is more accessible than a mailing list? I think the KLL way worked very well, because I certainly had the entire archive of what happened at KLL. There's communication about what happened during an activation and what we're doing and what parts of the world we're mapping and what are the requirements. But there's also a need to talk about how the activation itself is going. There needs to be people who are open for that sort of a question. I took out the names because I didn't want to sort of offend anyone. But essentially, like, someone wants to talk about their impression of how the activation is going. Someone who's part of the hard community has questions about the effectiveness of our operation.
Current community
Fortunately, there was someone
that gives us a better
who was willing to take on time to
these
do
are
that,
the people who are actually going to use our
proactively build this
and that's something you cannot detect like by automation. Like, you can just say that, okay, this is a hole in the image. This is
I think there's a bit of a bias in terms of how we approach governments.
But you can't say that image is going to be used by people.
I think it's been largely based on many of our impressions on how
here
the
balance of both of them comes. Like, we can identify the places, but then it's also important that that image is used by someone.
To work with
and this is where the involvement of people
the part of the world that I come from. So Nepal,
that's
the
why
week
sometimes
after,
the priority,
there were
even
many
if we
groups of
identify
people who were
places where we
deploying
don't have
drones to
imagery,
get high-resolution imagery to identify,
bigger priority
to do damage
the request that we receive from
and
some of the working groups.
the government decided to ban drones because they're scared.
I guess, like, to answer the question, like, a bit of both.
I got on the phone
it would
with
be really nice
the
to
Indian
have,
Space
like,
Research,
these kind of
one of
feedbacks
the
from
individuals
people
that I know at the Indian
that can
Space
say
Research
that, oh, your image is old, Bing is not there, and we don't have anything, so like we can proactively work on that request.
They also
but
do
then
a lot
again,
of
like,
amazing work.
if there is no community, then the only way that you can improve the imagery and the map is through, like, detecting.
But we knew that they had access to some of the amazing imagery, and we wanted to see if we can get that. I did not have any contract or written approval in terms of using this imagery, but it was very verbal over the phone, a 30-minute conversation. I don't think I was supposed to share this, but I wanted to share this anyway. I posted this in a private repository at Mapbox to just tell people, okay, listen, guys, I need to look into something else, but here's imagery. You need to help me process this and put this on the wiki. It was possible, but I want to sort of paint this picture of how building those relationships at governments is more important. Sometimes the governments that we work with are not that proactive, or they have higher priorities to deal with. So building that sort of a relationship with people is more important to get things done faster. I don't have any screenshots, but this is quite, I mean, it's kind of hard to sort of communicate, but I felt really happy and welcoming being part of that activation and sort of being part of the activation leadership because everyone was respectful to each other. And I think that's something that we all sort of hold very close to our hearts, and we need to sort of nurture that as much as possible. This is definitely a stressful time for everyone, and there are like different groups of people, chats going on from different pods, there are emails and requests and media and questions. And it can get certainly frustrating for many of us, but just holding on to like your coolness and sort of respecting each other is very important. I wanted to share some numbers in terms of how effective the work that we did was, just in terms of numbers. We managed to sort of quadruple road mileage in Nepal in under 48 hours. In 4 days, we managed to map over 10,000 square kilometers of the whole area of the country. This is kind of like the rough number of mappers, but we had just over 5,000 mappers, out of which over 3,500, or at least 3,500 were new mappers. That's kind of almost 70%. And I think this is true for many hard activations. We suddenly get a new group of people who really wants to help. And I think that's one of the things that all of us take advantage of at heart, is that when something goes wrong, there are people around the world who really want to help, and we want to tap into that sort of feeling of people to be able to create a public resource that everyone can use. So it wasn't easy to work with these 3,544 new mappers. There were questions in the mailing list. There were training, there were Skype, there were phone calls, there were IRC. I think we need to start thinking about how we can train these new groups of people when there's an activation. Just more numbers, sort of just summing up all the data that we collected over the course of 2 weeks. You can see like these numbers sort of speak for themselves. So when OSM Analytics came out a few months ago, I went and looked at how it was to add so much data, and it's sort of kind of mind-blowing to see how much building data got added in just over a few weeks. So this is the possibility. This is what's possible with the community and the tools that we have. Just a map, I think the gray is old data, and any green, yellow, and red are the data that was added in 48 hours. So that's the coverage, and that's the amount of data that was added. Just to sort of recap, what are the things that we can do better? I think we need to build more capacity. We need to sort of onboard more people to the activation leadership. We need to build more focused guides. We need to build very localized content. Build a stronger network. I think these anchors are really what makes a lot of the activation easier, and a lot of how the activation kind of pans out. We need to build experts. We need to identify those groups of people who we can tap into and just call for when there's a need. Build better ground support. We need to start experimenting with more tools that we can do to verify data on the ground. And together, just sort of like build better resources. I'm around today, and I'm also around at State of the Map. So if you have ideas on starting to work on some of these things, come find me at the POF, and thanks so much.